It's my pleasure to introduce Lionel Windsor now. Lionel will be delivering a paper entitled The Purpose of Israel in Romans. Lionel is a New Testament lecturer here at Moore College, and his doctoral study focused on Paul's understanding of Jewish identity in relation to God's wider purposes for the nations as seen in the Old Testament. He's published several academic books and articles on this topic of the purpose of Israel in Romans, and I think his lectures on Romans 9 to 11 are the best part of third year, so there you go. I'm really looking forward to this talk. Just a reminder for the Slido questions to go onto Lionel's room now for those questions, but why don't we welcome Lionel up.
Thanks, Tom. After three papers on individual verses and passages, I'm wondering if I've bit off a little bit more than I can chew. We're covering the book of Romans and the overall shape of biblical theology. But we're doing it through a specific question, so that's okay. Just as a note about the paper, this is very much a work in progress. I'm writing an article and maybe a few articles. I'm also riding a wave of cutting-edge Pauline scholarship. These issues are all the rage right now, and many of the things I'm dealing with have only just been published in the last few months or this year, so thanks very much to the library for keeping us all here at Moore College up to date with that scholarship. But it means that I actually haven't fully made up my mind on all the details and all the new ideas. So I want to share where I'm at, get feedback from faculty and others. The question is, in biblical theology, and especially in Paul, is Jewish distinctiveness a bug or a feature? Is it a problem to be solved, or is it something to be embraced? That question is actually very important for how various people do biblical theology and how we do biblical theology overall. So Donald Robinson, a key stimulus for Moore College's biblical theological thinking here at college, I thought it'd be good to start with a quote from him, writing in 1961, actually speaking at Barney's, I think, just down the road in 1961. He says, "Modern evangelical Christians tend to adopt one or other of two opposite positions, both of which, in my opinion, are mistaken, though not equally mistaken. On the one hand, there is the position of dispensationalism, which accords little or no significance to the presence of believing Jews in the New Testament churches and relegates all the Old Testament promises about the restoration of Israel to a period which is still future even today. On the other hand is the more usual view, which regards all Christians as constituting the new Israel in this present age, and which therefore refers the promises made concerning Israel in the Old Testament to the Christian church. In my judgment, neither of these views represents the position of St. Paul and the other New Testament writers. What neither position allows for, but what I believe to be the teaching of the New Testament, is that God's distinctive promises to Israel are in the New Testament fulfilled, not to all believers, but to Jewish believers who constitute the restored remnant of Israel, and that Gentile believers are the inheritors of other promises altogether, that is, the promises made in the Old Testament to the nations who should come to Israel's light. This Old Testament role of Israel as royal priesthood and servant of the Lord, and this coming of the Gentiles to find salvation in Jerusalem, form the basis of the New Testament program of the gospel. When the day of the Lord arrived with the resurrection of Christ, Israel found its fulfilment, not indeed in the outward form of the nation, but in the remnant of Jewish believers, of whom the 12 apostles were the foundation members. The coming of the Gentiles to the light, which went forth from Jerusalem, was also fulfilled in the many Gentile believers who responded to the gospel brought to them by members of that Jewish remnant. In the minds of Paul and the other New Testament writers, the salvation of Israel and the salvation of the Gentiles were two distinct aspects of the gospel program. But though distinct, they were intimately connected with one another, and indeed both were ongoing processes throughout the New Testament period. So there's Donald Robinson's stimulating work, and in case you think that was just an issue in the 60s, it is still very much the case that question is key in much Pauline scholarship today. Bruce Longenecker writing questions concerning supersessionism and those kinds of things that lots of people are asking. So to think about some contemporary Pauline studies, there's a tension between denying and overemphasising Jewish distinctiveness. It's an ongoing present discussion in Pauline theology. So the increasingly inaccurately named New Perspective on Paul, proponents of the New Perspective have often problematised Jewish distinctiveness in their accounts of Jewish theology. So it's a problem to be solved. The idea is in Paul's efforts to include Gentiles in God's grace, what Paul's doing is dismantling Jewish ethnic boundaries and privileges. So here's a classic Tom Wright, both from the 90s and then more recent work. Paul in Romans has systematically transferred the privileges and attributes of Israel to the Messiah and his people. Or the family solidarity of Israel was, after all, one of the load-bearing pillars along with those others, but the kind of revision that has happened leaves this new family as the sole, this new family meaning the church, as the sole concrete visible symbol of the new worldview. Israel's God, through Israel's Messiah and his death and resurrection, has himself redefined the family, as he always warned that he would, and has done so thoroughly, explicitly, and effectively. So that's the New Perspective, which is an older perspective now, because what's becoming more the rage now is something called Paul within Judaism. And in many ways it's a reaction against the New Perspective, although some people call it the radical New Perspective, so it's a bit strange. But in Paul within Judaism, it affirms a very strong distinctiveness and a positive value for Jewish identity in Paul's letters, much like dispensationalism. So here's Paula Fredrickson. Thus we see that Paul maintains and nowhere erases the distinction between Israel and the nations, nor does he redefine Israel so that it means only the followers of Christ. And a common feature of this Paul within Judaism, it's not everywhere in this idea, but it's very common, is that when Paul's writing, he only really cares about Gentiles. He's not saying anything particularly in his letters to Jews. Paul's not speaking to Jews. Now, the problem with Paul within Judaism, I think, is that it's far more positive to Israel than the Bible is. So just contrast Paula Fredrickson. She says, "Here I stand with those scholars who have emphasised Paul's self-image as apostle to the nations and his letters addressed to non-Jews. Every negative thing that Paul says about Jewish law, thus, he says, first of all, with respect to non-Jews. The law was a curse for Gentiles. The law registered sin for Gentiles. The law brought slavery and death for Gentiles." And then you just read Deuteronomy. "But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you." And if you know Deuteronomy and the curses, you can compare that to various prophetic voices. And so actually the Paul within Judaism actually finds it difficult to read Paul, and sometimes, especially Romans 11, not quite sure what to do with Romans 11. Even perhaps more recently, a new way forward has been suggested, just to note that Paul himself names his most important scriptural sources as prophetic. And he does that at the beginning and the end of Romans. He says, I'm looking at the prophets. And there's this idea that Paul is bringing from the prophets. Now, when you look at the prophets, you actually see that many of the things that Paul says, he is drawing from the prophets or the prophetic scriptures. You could include prophetic things in the law as well, there as well as he speaks. Now, it's very Christocentric. It's not as if Paul is just, forgetting about Christ, but he is reading the prophets. And there's two elements in the prophets that are both important. Firstly, there's a strong critique of Israel's failure to keep the law, leading to God's judgment. And secondly, there are future eschatological hopes for Israel's restoration. And I want to say both are very important in Paul's understanding of the purpose of Israel. Paul, within Judaism, tends to downplay that critique, but it's there. And Jason Staples, most recently, has picked that up. And I'm not entirely sure fully what I think of Jason Staples because I haven't properly digested it yet. Jason's book is very new. But here, Jason Staples talks about Israelite restoration eschatology. And he says that reflects a narrative framework that he's seeing in the prophets, but elsewhere as well, because of biblical Israel's covenantal infidelity and disobedience. 2, Israel fell under the covenantal curses, most notably the dissolution, captivity, exile and dispersion of Israel, sometimes characterised as the death of the people as a whole, from which God will redeem, reunify and restore all 12 tribes of Israel to covenantal favour, including an inward ethical transformation of the people to ensure the restoration will be lasting, an eschatological miracle akin to resurrection from the dead. So what I'm doing in my particular research is asking the question, well, how is Paul understanding this when it comes to Romans, and particularly just that question of Jewish distinctiveness? So here's my thesis in a nutshell. Paul, like most of his fellow Jews, he's sort of within Judaism in this, he continues to affirm Jewish distinctiveness. And he's arguing with his fellow Jews, not about the existence of Jewish distinctiveness, but about the divine purposes for Jewish distinctiveness in relation to wider concerns about God's glory and the rest of humanity. And God has both negative and positive purposes in mind for Israel in relation to his wider purposes. And they're drawn from the prophetic scriptures, which Paul reads in light of Christ. Now, people have mentioned this down through the decades, but as far as I can tell, there's not been a good systematic study of all the places in Romans where Paul talks about Jewish distinctiveness and what God's purpose for Jewish distinctiveness is, those purpose statements. So that's what I'm seeking to do. And I want to focus in Romans. I've read through Romans and kept reading through Romans, looking at places in Romans, key passages, that contain these 3 elements together. Firstly, an expression of distinct Jewish identity. Secondly, an expression of a divine purpose for that distinct Jewish identity. And thirdly, an expression of broader concerns. That is, here's distinct Jewish identity. God has a purpose for that that's bigger than just for Jewish people. And with a special interest in prophetic references, and seeking to bring that together into a coherent reading of Romans. Work in progress. Here are then forms of expression in Romans. So firstly, what are the different terms that Paul uses to talk about distinct Jewish identity? Here are what I'd call core Jewish ethnic identity markers. If you want to say this is what being Jewish is, here they are. And I'll just, do the English unless I have to go back to the Greek. I've tried to give translations, my own translations, as I go. So Judaios, the Jew or the Judean, linked to the place Judea, linked to the tribe Judah or the southern kingdom Judah, which is now the Roman province Judea. Paritomes, physical circumcision. That is Jewish, to be Jewish, physically circumcised. When Paul talks about things according to the flesh, normally he's talking about ethnic identity there, or kataphusin, according to nature. He also a number of times mentions his own kin, his own fellow members of his own ethnic group or race, the Jews. So physical circumcision is actually quite strongly Jewish, especially in Rome. To be circumcised was to be Jewish, symbol of the covenant between God and Abraham. It also implies law keeping more generally, but it's not just one law among many. It's like saying I'm a person who's going to keep the law. There's also more broadly expressions of relationship to ancestors. So they're ethnic categories, but that's not core Jewish ethnic categories because, for example, descent from Abraham doesn't necessarily mean you're Jewish. You can be descended from Abraham, and there's various other descendants from Abraham as well. Same for Isaac, and indeed the same for Jacob, interestingly, depending on how you take it, because Jacob is the father of 12 tribes, one of whom is Judah, and some of whom are part of the southern kingdom. However, this is still very Jewish. These are the ancestors of the Jews. So Paul talks about the fathers. Abraham as forefather, as father. He has seed, he has offspring. There's Isaac, Jacob, Israel, Israelite, tribe of Benjamin. And I'm really taken with Jason Staples' work. And like I say, I haven't quite worked out everything I think about him. I don't like what he says about justification so much. But this point, Staples' point is that Israel is not the same as Jude. He actually says, you look at the Old Testament, Jews, Judah, southern kingdom, that tribe or those members of that southern kingdom, Israel's a bigger category than that. Or it can refer to the northern kingdom as well. And so he says that actually if you read Paul in that light, that Old Testament light, then it can actually help. What about divine privileges? Well, there's various divine privileges that belong first and foremost to Jews. Not only to Jews, but especially to Jews. Possession of the divine scriptures, the scripture, to write, the written word or the letter. The possession of divine law, God's law. Now, the interpretation of the law, people disagreed about that in Paul's day, but there was that common view that the law itself, the Torah, was fundamental to Jewish identity. And that's partly what being Jewish meant. You gathered to talk about, you read, you discussed the law. You might disagree about what the law means, but that's what you did being Jewish. There's very interesting Greek prepositional phrases, and sometimes they can be obscured in the translations, which is why I'm trying to bring them out a little literally here. There's the law or instruction. There is one who is in law or sphere of law. And that involves having the law and being a hearer of the law. That's not necessarily negative. Sometimes it's translated as under law, but it's not the same. There's also one who's from the law, which I think is kind of seeming an ethnic category. I've arisen from the law. It's not the same as being under law. There's also law-giving and mention of Moses and commandment. There's also the fact that Israel or Jews were particularly first original recipients of divine promises, the idea of things being promised beforehand and promises. Israel, Jews being especially God's people, God's inheritance, the idea of adoption belonging especially to Israelites in chapter 9, verse 4. Jews are the natural inhabitants of God's holy place and the natural participants in temple worship, in the physical temple. So Paul talks about Jerusalem, Zion, which is the place of the Davidic Messiah. He talks about the glory, the covenants, the worship. Also at one point, the saints, which is a natural way to refer to those who dwell in Jerusalem in chapter 15. The Jewish people are naturally related to the Davidic Messiah. Christ is from the seed of David according to the flesh. He's the root of Jesse. And from Israel is the Christ according to the flesh. And so Paul Fredrickson points this out. Paul talks about Jesus as Christ, but especially at the beginning and end of Romans, there's this idea that he is from Israel according to the flesh. And Paul wants to emphasise that at the beginning and the end. There's also the metaphor of the olive tree, where the Jewish people are the natural branches of the olive tree. There's the various terms. Now, I've got to say that, of course, Jewish distinctiveness in Romans is relativised in various ways. I really want to say that. I feel like we can take for granted, if you know anything about Romans, there's a basic and uncontroversial observation that there are places in Romans where Paul clearly relativises Jewish distinctiveness in various significant ways. For completeness, here they all are. Paul says both Jew and Gentile. He talks about all. He says at one point there is no difference. He talks about there's no favouritism, not only Jews but also Gentiles, simple negations of relevance. He says, this is not relevant, this distinction doesn't matter, at various places. He talks in various points, especially at the beginning of chapter 2, he doesn't mention Jews, he says humans, and even if he is talking to Jews, what matters is that they're human. He says God's God of both Jews and Gentiles. And then he says you're going to hear the law. That doesn't matter so much as keeping the law. Same with circumcision. He says in chapter 9, Israel would have been just like the other nations, except for the remnant that God had chosen. Both Jews and Greeks are under sin, Boasting in Jewish law-keeping and justification is excluded. There's no distinction when it comes to very key things like eschatological salvation, no distinction when it comes to justification by faith. The promise and the inheritance don't come by the law, but they come by faith. Publicly recognised Jewish identity and circumcision in the flesh brings no praise from God. And there's no distinction when it comes to sin and justification by faith. I think I've said that, I'm going to say it again. Okay, so in these really key theological areas, there is no distinction. And that would be fine. We could say, well, that's Paul's theology, isn't it? Except that's not all he says. And that's the point I want to make. At certain points, there's the idea of these privileges being extended, or the relationship to ancestors being extended. So descent from Abraham. You can be seed of Abraham without being Jewish, chapter 4. And perhaps also, and this is Jason Staples that I haven't made up my mind about yet, perhaps even 11:26, perhaps Israel is being extended to Gentiles as well. And of course, the divine privileges are extended to Gentiles in some ways, but important ways. Israel's scriptures, clearly relevant for Gentiles. Now, Christ following Gentiles can fulfill the law by Christ and the Spirit. The promises, we can be called God's people. Gentile Christ followers can be heirs, indeed adopted. And while Gentile believers don't dwell in God's holy place in Jerusalem, more importantly, God's Spirit dwells in them. So we can participate in worship, the most important worship, the rational worship in 12:1. We can be an offering, called saints, called holy, summed up in the metaphor of the olive tree, and we're all in Christ. Okay, so that's really important. That's really basic to Romans. That all really matters. I just want to name those things because I've still got a specific question. Because, firstly, no core ethnic identity markers are extended to Christ-following Gentiles, Jew and circumcision. Now, some people say, chapter 2, verse 28 to 29, that Christ-believing Gentiles are called Jews here. I don't think that's the case. I've argued that elsewhere, and most recently in the last few months, I've seen an article by Forster, which you can check it out. Staples believes this as well. That's not quite what Paul is saying, I don't have time to go into detail about that. But just very quickly, if you look at chapter 3, verse 1, if Paul has just called all Christians Jews in chapter 2, verse 29, then why does he suddenly not use that redefinition in chapter 3, verse 1, where he seems to be talking directly about ethnic Jews again? Okay, so when I say this is important, I mean the first point's important, that there's still Jewish distinctiveness going on in Romans, because there are lots of expressions indicating divine purpose in Romans in relation to Jewish distinctiveness. And as I kept reading, I went, there's more than I thought. There's a whole lot of words which talk about God's purpose, purpose, plan, to want, to prepare beforehand, directive, command. There's quite a few purpose clauses, in order that, plus subjunctive, hina, plus subjunctive. Prepositions indicating a final cause, for the sake of. Expressions of God's purposes in prophetic text being fulfilled. Promises coming about, place, fullness, fulfillment, to arrive, to arise. There's expressions of goal, prepositions indicating a goal or divinely planned result, at least, to the end that, unto, ace plus the substantive, ace top plus the infinitive. Prepositions indicating source, from, as far as. Lexemes indicating a goal or fitting end, like telos, end. Expressions of logical causality, if with an inevitable result. Other expressions of order, things like first, and then just sometimes then, and places where this leads to that, since, until. Then there's agency, through, instrumentality or agency, through plus the genitive, by, n plus the dative, or just the simple dative. Expressions of a distinct actor fulfilling divine purposes with others, among, with, ideas of God using an instrument or a vessel to achieve things. Lexemes indicating a benefit that one person or group provides to others. The idea to benefit or to help, to support. The idea of overflow from one person or group to others. This is argued by a number of articles, chapter 3, verse 1, to overflow, to abound, a dative of benefit for the benefit of, expressions of obligation. One group is indebted to another. And then there's also expressions of revelation. God entrusts divine revelation to one personal group, to the Jewish people, and then there's this idea of it being conveyed to others. Guide, light, tutor, teacher, that's ironic. Proclaim, display, make known, testify, demonstrate, and then lots of other words bringing about knowledge of theological truths in some way. In relation to broader divine concerns, which I won't go into as much detail as, but here's God's big concerns in Romans that Paul mentions. When Paul talks about all humanity, he often uses that word pars, all, everybody, or anthropos. This is for humans. This isn't just for Jews. He talks about the nations, the Gentiles, sometimes the Greeks, or often the Greeks actually, the world, the earth. Paul talks about himself as the apostle to the nations. Very important, there's this broad concern of the glory or honour of God's name in the wider world beyond Israel. That's huge in Romans, or it's a big theme. There's the vindication or display or exemplification of God's general purposes or attributes, his justice, his truth, his choice, his power, his grace, his kindness, severity, wisdom, knowledge, judgment. The Messiah's Lord over all the world, revelation of sin to all the world, divine judgment of the world, divine justification and salvation by faith for the world. They're the broader concerns. And then there's quite a few appeals in those places to prophetic texts. Paul mentions the prophets, so he says at the beginning, through the prophets. He talks about not just the law, but the law and the prophets, the prophetic scriptures. And here's just a small sample of some of the key ones. But there's many, many more where the prophetic word is very important for Paul in all of that. So, that's just a summary. And what I want to do is then say, here it is in Romans. Here's a whole lot of places. So I want to read Romans with you and point out things that maybe you haven't seen before. I'd like to say that my PhD was done on all the bits of Romans that we don't preach on. Because we're very interested in the theological truths of sin, salvation, grace. Of course, that's fundamental. But sometimes here are the things that we don't always pick up. So I've colour-coded it, and I'm not going to be reading it fully in Greek. I just want to show you some things. Yellow, here's where Paul has an expression of distinct Jewish identity. Green, an expression of divine purpose for that distinct Jewish identity. Cyan is an expression of broader concerns relating to divine purposes, and purple with prophetic references. So, to begin with, some places that aren't particularly controversial or difficult, but just worth mentioning them. Romans 1:1-2, right at the beginning, the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. God intended the Scriptures of Israel to contain prior promises of the gospel. And then right at the end of the letter, the revelation that was kept hidden but now has been revealed and made known through the prophetic scriptures according to the directive of the eternal God unto the obedience of faith unto all the nations. I'm being a bit literal in my translation here just to bring this out. God's used the scriptures intentionally to make known the obedience of faith to all the nations. You see that in Romans 15:4 as well. The Messiah, who is over all, Paul wants to make sure that people know that he comes from Judah. So concerning his son, what does Paul first want to say about his son? Who came about from the seed of David according to the flesh, Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship under the obedience of faith among all the nations for the sake of his name. So the fleshly lineage of the Davidic Judaic king is the source of Jesus, God's son, and our Lord, and Paul's ministry bringing about the obedience of faith and the honour of God's name among all the nations. It starts there. Romans chapter 9, verse 5, Paul's kin, whose are the fathers, patriarchs, and from whom, according to the flesh, is the Christ, the Messiah, the one who is God over all, blessed forever. Amen. So Paul's ethnic kin, they're naturally related to the patriarchs. They're the fleshly, the natural source of the Christ, who is in fact God Paul wants to say, over all. Romans chapter 1, verse 16. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for as the power of God for salvation for all who believe, for the Jew or Judean first, yet also for the Greek. So Jews have a place first in the order of God's intended salvation through faith for all people. And of course the question is, what is that first? What does that first mean? Well, we'll see it play out in a moment. And this is something that we see, and probably you've seen, that you're used to, it's not particularly controversial. Justification by faith is borne witness to by the law and the prophets. So like you read the law along with the prophets and you see justification by faith. So verse 17, this is a theme statement in Romans, key theme statement. For a righteousness from God in it has been revealed from faith unto faith, just as it stands written, but the righteous one from faith will live. So the prophetic scriptures, Habakkuk here, testify to a righteousness of or from God. I'm going to go for from, that is now revealed in the gospel. And maybe there's an order here. Maybe there's a revelatory or a missional order. Maybe it's Jewish faith to Gentile faith. There's about 13 different possibilities as to what that means. Romans chapter 3, verse 21 to 22. But now, apart from the law, a righteousness from God has been revealed, testified to by the law and the prophets. A righteousness from God through faith in Jesus Christ unto all those who believe. So the law, when read in light of the prophets especially, testifies to a righteousness from God, which is for all who believe. Romans chapter 4, verses 1 to 25. I can only summarise this here. It's an extended argument about the wider divine purpose for Abraham's faith. Covers most of chapter 4, but what you see is expressions of distinct Jewish identity there. Abraham, who is our forefather according to the flesh, and there's the scriptures, writing, promise. There's expressions of divine purpose. I've appointed you to the end that he should become for the sake of us. What's Abraham for the sake of? Bigger things: believing, faith, righteousness, justification, the blessing of forgiveness that is for humans, for the uncircumcision, for all people, for every people, for many nations. And there's a prophetic reference there as well. It's not only Genesis, it's also David. So Abraham and the scriptural promises, including the law, like Genesis, were intended by God as the blessing of justification for all who believe from every nation. Similarly, Romans chapter 10, verse 4. For the end of the law is Christ, resulting in righteousness for everyone who believes. We often skip over that little word all, past, but it's really important for Paul. It's not just for this group of people, it's for everybody. And yet it is the law. It's the law given to Israel, righteousness for all who believe. Now, let's look at some more interesting things. What's actually happening here? Well, as we read Romans chapters 2 to 8, how do the law and the prophets bear witness to justification by faith? Well, there is a very significant negative element to the law's operation amongst Israel in God's purposes, which can't be ignored. Now, that negative element, I want to say, it's not foreign to Judaism. I'm not reading Paul outside Judaism or something here. It's consistent with the prophetic witness to the law's work amongst Israel and the nations. That is what the prophets say the law does, and it's there very much in chapters 2 to 8. So chapter 2, 17 to 3:8. Firstly, you look at verses 9 to 10 of Romans. There's two anticipatory phrases. So the overall thrust of chapter 2, verses 1 to 16 is universal judgment. All humanity, regardless of ethnic status, regardless whether you've got the written law, doesn't matter. God shows no favouritism. And yet in there's two little phrases, two anticipatory phrases that foreshadow what Paul's about to say. God will do all this, but he'll do it through Jew first. Affliction and distress will come on every individual human who accomplishes what is evil, Jew first, yet also Greek. But there will be glory and honour and peace for everyone who accomplishes what is good, Jew first, yet also Greek, for there is no favouritism with God. So there's that little Jew first thing. What is that? How does that work? Paul then spells it out. In chapter 2, verses 17 to 27, there seems to be the first set of statements for God's purposes for distinct Jewish identity seems to suggest that God's purposes have actually failed. So first, Paul sets out a particular understanding that some people have of this is how God's purposes through Jews are supposed to work. Now, if you're named as Jewish and rest on the law and boast in God and know the truth and approve of the excellent things, having been instructed from the law, and if you are sure that you yourself are a guide for the blind, light for those in darkness, educator of fools, teacher of infants, having the form of knowledge and truth in the law, that's a straightforward, in Paul's day, understanding of the divine purpose of distinct Jewish identity. This is how it works. Jews have the law, so they can teach the law, they can enlighten the world, and they can solve the problem of sin, darkness, all the things that Paul's talked about in chapter 1. But Paul goes on to say, well, you who teach others, you do not teach yourself. You who boast in the law, through transgression of the law, dishonour God. For the name of God, through you, is slandered among the nations, just as it is written, stands written. So Jews who haven't taught the law, yet transgress the law, and there's a lot of them, have failed to achieve God's purposes for the honour of his name among the nations. Worse, they seem to have specifically achieved the opposite of God's purposes. And yet at the same time, that's what the prophets said would happen. That's what is meant to happen, according to the Isaianic witness. Just note the word transgression there. The word transgress is more than sin. It means specific breaking of a defined and clear law. And that's what made Jewish sin so bad in Paul's eyes. Because it's not just that they're sinning, it's that they have a very clear law that they're bound to by circumcision, and they sin against that very clear law. That's the problem. That's the issue. Romans 2:25 to 27, there's also purposes for circumcision in relation to others that fail, and here again, transgression reappears. Next slide. For circumcision, now here's where I'm doing some translations that I've argued for elsewhere. So I can't justify these translations. But circumcision would benefit who? Possibly the nations, the thing that Paul's just been talking about, or at least God's glory, if you practice the law. But if you're a transgressor of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Therefore, if the uncircumcised one keeps the requirements of the law, won't his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? And this one who naturally is uncircumcised yet keeps the law will judge you, who through letter and circumcision are a transgressor of the law. Okay, so circumcision would be great if they kept the law, but they haven't. It seems like God's purposes have failed. Maybe there's a glimmer of hope because Jewish sin is clearly seen as transgression by the uncircumcised person. And then verses 28 and 29, again, I can't argue for this here, but I've argued for it elsewhere. It's not the public Jew, nor public fleshly circumcision, but the hidden Jew and circumcision of the heart in spirit, not letter, whose is the praise, not from humans, but from God. There are Jews who are truly circumcised according to the heart, the spirit. These Jews will receive praise. The problem is that praise won't come from humans. Humans won't recognise it, only God. So how will it benefit God's glory among the nations? Well, that's why chapter 3, verses 1 to 8, very difficult passage for many. There's a common assumption, and one of the reasons that chapter 3, verses 1 to 8 is seen as very difficult is because of a common assumption, but it's not universal. This assumption that it talks about God's faithfulness, and there's this assumption that God's faithfulness is his faithfulness to save Israel. But actually, if you read this passage in terms of God's faithfulness to judge, that is, he said he'll judge, and he does, he's faithful to that word, everything's actually much clearer. There's a lot of confusion. People say there must be speech and character here. And I'm following on from Will Timmins here, who's pointed this out. I've got a couple of translations here, which I think are right, and there's other articles that have argued this point as well. But what's Paul saying? What then is the overflow from the Jew? Or what is the benefit from the circumcision? Much in every way. For the first thing is that they were entrusted with the oracles of God. For what end? If some were unfaithful, their unfaithfulness doesn't nullify God's faithfulness, does it? Not at all. Let God be true and every human a liar, just as it stands written, so that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you judge. I think what Paul's saying here is that Jewish unfaithfulness, that sin, especially that sin in the law, having the law, it achieves God's purposes and glory for his world. It benefits God's name being honoured and glorified among the nations. How? Because Jews were entrusted with God's very words. And so when they sin, they demonstrate with great clarity that God's judgment against their sin is just. And that demonstrates God's faithfulness to his word of judgment and shows everybody else that God is actually a just judge of the world. When those who have the law sin, it proves clearly the justice of God's universal judgment. And if you read it that way, then chapter 3 verses 5 to 8 make a lot of sense. For if our unrighteousness demonstrates God's justice, what shall we say? God isn't unjust to carry out his wrath, is he? I speak humanly. Not at all. Since how could God judge the world? But if God's truth by my lie overflows unto his glory, why am I still judged as a sinner? So Paul needs to deal with that. It seems like it's unfair, but the point is that Jewish sin especially demonstrates God's justice in judging the world. It achieves God's purposes for glory among the nations and shows that God is just in judging, which is consistent with the prophetic witness of the law. You see the same thing in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 24. You also see it in Jubilees chapter 1, and Staples has argued that point as well, which leads into chapter 3, verses 9 to 20. Through the law comes knowledge of sin to the world. Often Romans commentators, when they're talking about Jewish sin, they often skip quickly to, the sin of Jews was to reject Jesus. And you think, well, okay, it was wrong to reject Jesus. It means that's the only place where you'll find salvation. But actually, Jewish sin and Israel's sin is breaking the law. And that's what Paul spells out here. He shows that what he's been saying about both Jewish and Greek sin is consistent with the prophetic witness, that all are under sin, verse 9. And he completes it with this statement: for we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those in the sphere of the law, to Jewish people, but for a wider purpose, in order that every mouth may be silenced and all the world may be liable to God's justice. Therefore, from works of law, all flesh, no flesh at all, will be justified before him. For through the law comes recognition of sin. The purpose of the law given specifically to Jews, those in the sphere of the law, is to bring about the recognition of sin in the entire world, and so make the whole world answerable to God's justice clearly. Now, this is spelled out further, say Romans chapter 4, verses 11 to 15, where we return to Abraham, and there's a complex sentence there, but I think it's understandable if you see, well, there's a couple of purposes for Abraham. Firstly, he's got faith, and his faith is a great paradigm of law-keeping. Sorry, that's wrong. His faith is a great paradigm of justification by faith, and his circumcision is the great paradigm of law-keeping, which isn't to be emulated by the nations, but is important for the nations nevertheless. The law, what does it do? Verse 15, it accomplishes wrath. And where there is no law, neither is there transgression. What's Paul saying there? The divine purpose for God's law being given clearly to Israel is to turn sin into clear and obvious transgression, and so to clearly show up the justice of God's wrath against sin. And so in that way, it accomplishes wrath. Chapter 5, verse 13, Paul says something similar. Until the law came, sin was in the world, but sin is not taken into account when there is no law. Same idea. God's purposes for giving the law to Israel was to ensure that sin is fully taken into account by showing sin up for what it really is. Chapter 5, verse 20, the law slipped in order to increase the misdeed. But where sin increased, grace overflowed abundantly, in order that grace may reign through righteousness unto eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. So that the law given to Israel had a purpose, to increase sin, so that grace may be increased even more. Chapter 7, you see that coming through in chapter 7. There's a lot of issues in chapter 7 there. But again, you've got this idea of the law or the commandment with expressions of divine purpose coming about and producing sin, death, die, kill. It reveals sin. Okay, that's all very negative. And so much of Romans 2 to 8 has that negativity. Sometimes people see glimmers of hope in the beginning of chapter 3, the advantage of the Jew, entrusted with the oracles of God. But I don't think that's positive either. That's negative as well. And that's why at the beginning of chapter 9, after Paul has laid out this theology, he is in so much anguish for his fellow Jews. Do you see why? Because he's in grief. God has used his people as an instrument to display his wrath. He's given them his law deliberately so that they would fail, they would sin, he could judge them, and then he could bring about his wider purposes. That's been the argument of chapters 2 to 8. And Paul says, I'm in great anguish now about Israel. Because, hold on, is that what's going on? They're my kinsfolk according to the flesh, Israelites, adoption, glory, covenants, law-giving, worship, promises. From them according to the flesh is the Christ, the one who's over all. Israel's God's instrument in bringing about the worldwide revelation of Christ to the world. How's he done it? By showing that we're all sinners, and especially Israel, so that we're driven to faith in Jesus Christ, or bringing us to faith in Jesus Christ. So is Israel just an instrument? Is Israel just been used by God? Is that all Israel is? Well, the first point is, well, yes. And God's allowed to do that because he's God. So that's chapter 9. It's consistent with Israel's history. And I won't read it, but that's, I think, the argument of chapter 9. Yep, God can do that. He's allowed to. He's God. He's allowed to use Israel as his instrument, his vessel. He's the potter. We're the clay. He can make a pot for this and he can make a pot for that. And he can call anyone he likes, and that's chapter 9. But as we get to, and then there's chapter 10, well, there is a solution, there is an answer, and that is Christ. But Israel has not only sinned and been judged by God, but the majority of Israel has not even come to Christ. They've stumbled over the stumbling stone. They've sinned, and then the place where they should have gone to for the solution, the Messiah, Jesus, they've stumbled over that. They're trying to achieve righteousness by themselves still. But the end of the law should be Christ, resulting in righteousness for everyone who believes. And so that's the argument of chapter 11, that Paul says there is hope, but what it's going to come through is the proclamation of the gospel. And that's the argument of chapter 11. He says, God hasn't rejected his inheritance, has he? Not at all. For even I am an Israelite, from the seed of Abraham, the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. And then he looks at the prophets, Elijah and others. So his hope for Israel, finally, chapter 11, begins with the observation that he, the preacher of the gospel to the nations, he is from Abraham, Israel, Benjamin. Not just the sinners, but the preacher of the gospel. 11:11a. I ask then, it isn't the case that they made a misstep in order that they might fall over, is it? Not at all. There's that hina clause. Paul's point is that a possible construal of God's purposes for Israel is that God wanted Israel to stumble just to make them fall over. But no. By their misdeeds, salvation has come to the nations to the end that they will be driven to jealousy. So it's not, God's not just wanting them to fall. The fact that he's used them as an instrument for this actually means that there is now hope for Israel, so that they would be driven to jealousy. If their misstep means the wealth of the world and their defeat means the wealth of the nations, how much more their fullness? If their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be except life from the dead? If God's used Israel as an instrument negatively to bring about his worldwide purposes, as the prophets say, how much greater will his purposes be for Israel themselves? And then you've got, again, the metaphor of the olive tree, the idea of Israel as the natural branches that support, or the root at least supports, the Gentiles, and that shows the kindness and severity of God. So the Gentiles should not boast. And then this hardening in part has come to Israel until the fullness of the nations comes in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved, just as it stands written, the deliverer will come from Zion, He will turn ungodliness from Jacob. Paul actually changes the quote there. He doesn't just say the deliverer will come to Zion. He reminds his readers, I think, the deliverer is coming from Zion. And then he's got this complex interplay of God's purposes. Israel's disobedience means mercy to the Gentiles, which is a wider purpose. But because it's a wider purpose, that also means through the gospel, mercy even to Israel, and thereby mercy to all. And that's why there's this fitting praise as a result. So we get chapter 15, and this is reasonably straightforward. When you read chapter 15, you see Paul summing it up and saying, here is these expressions of Jewish identity, circumcision, promises of the fathers, on behalf of, to the end that, among, with, and arising wider concerns, the truth, the nations, all the peoples, glorifying God. And you've got this picture of God's name being glorified. But as Fredrickson points out, and I think she's right here in chapter 15 at least, the point is not that Israel and the Gentiles are the same. The point is that Israel and the Gentiles are together, glorifying God. And that's what matters the most, not a sameness, but a togetherness, a unity in glorifying God. Paul also sees that in his own priestly ministry. Okay, so there's my, running through Romans, seeking to go, where are all these expressions? And I'm seeing it all over the place. So I may be wrong, and so feel free to ask me why or say this doesn't work. But I think consistent with the biblical prophetic tradition, Paul initially characterises God's broader purposes for Jewish distinctives in negative and instrumental terms, but he ultimately moves beyond this negative characterisation to positive eschatological expressions of mercy and glory through and for Israel. And I want to add to that, through the preaching of the gospel. Is what he sees. There's also this sort of mystery, but I think that's still all caught up with the preaching of the gospel. Others may disagree, but I'm not a dispensationalist, so I disagree. Okay, thanks, Tom. Yeah.
Wow, thank you, Lionel. I'll give you a moment to catch your breath. That was great. I felt like seeing those colour coding, it was like Neo in the Matrix, as everything suddenly becomes clear. That was fantastic. We'll jump straight into questions because we've got quite a few. The first one is from George Athos. How do the Samaritans fit into the scheme of things? Do they come under God's promises to Israel, or are they enfolded within the promises to the nations?
So this is Jason Staples. Thanks, George. This is Jason Staples, and this is where I haven't fully process what Jason has said, and I need to fully process what George has said as well. This has all come out so recently, and helpfully. But Jason's point is that the all Israel is actually saying not just Judah, not just the southern kingdom, but the reunification of all the tribes that is predicted in the prophets and seen in, say, Ezekiel and other places. That the Gentiles are part of that. Now, Paul doesn't, I think, mention the Samaritans, but I'd like to know what Jason Staples says about the Samaritans, who are certainly there in Acts. The Samaritans are sort of, part of kind of all Israel, the old northern kingdom that has gone amiss and is going to be enfolded back in. So, yeah, I don't have a full answer to that, and I want to keep reading Staples on that.
Okay, thanks, Lionel. Are there any questions from the floor? Yes, Brendan.
If that passage 1 to 8 is mostly about how Judaism proves the justice of God through their sin, then what in 3:1? What is the parasuon of what is the advantage?
Yeah.
Why does that appear like
Sorry.
he's about to tell us there's a good thing about circumcision if he's about to say it's that they're all mortal sinners? How is that good?
So the question is, what is the advantage to the Jew or to the Judean if the purpose in 3:1 is for God to show his justice in response to their sin?
Yes. So if you, in chapter 3, verse 1, this is an article by Matthew Munkemeyer that I picked up and I think just has a lot of legs for it. They're strange words. So we translate that as advantage or sort of benefit for oneself. But actually, if you translate it as overflow or abundance overflowing to others, perison, so that's why I love the Philippians. And Opheleia usually is kind of a help to somebody else. Sometimes it means a help to yourself, but it's a help to somebody else. So I don't think Paul is asking the question directly, what good is it being a Jew for yourself? It's, what's the point of the whole Jew-Israel thing in God's purposes? How is that going to achieve the glory of God among the nations, which has been Paul's key concern, chapter 2, verse 24, especially if there's two kinds of Jew, chapter 2, verse 28 to 29. One kind of Jew is the public Jew, the one who everyone knows, who's just sinning. And then there's the other kind of Jew, the hidden Jew, the Jeremiah Jew, the prophetic Jew, who's got the circumcision of the heart hidden by the Spirit, but no one knows who they are, or no one sees them, no one praises them, no one cares about them. Well, how's that going to bring glory to God among the nations? So I think that it's consistent to say, yes, circumcision is of great value because it marks out a people who are the people of the law, who then go and break the law, and then as the law is broken, not only there's a specific law that gets broken, and what they do is then show the whole world how just God is, because it's not just that they're sinners, it's they've broken the law that God gave them. And that's of great advantage to the world. It's not a great advantage to them, and that's why Paul's in so much anguish in chapter 9.
Thanks, Lionel. This was the top voted question. What would you say to the claim that the Gentiles grafted into the olive tree are not Jews, but they are Israel?
Well, that is Jason Staples' claim, I think. And what I would say to that is I need to carefully read Jason Staples' work because, and quite seriously, I like the idea, but I haven't sifted through it to go, does it make sense of the text of Romans? So I actually don't know the answer to that question in my mind at the moment. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, please.
Now that the lessons of the ethnic divide, the Old Testament ethnic divide have been learned from Romans, is there any ongoing place or theological place for the ethnic Jewish person?
So the question is there any ongoing place for the ethnic Jewish person?
Yeah. So in Paul's mind, there certainly seems to be at the time, because they are the people of the law, but that means they're the people of God's word. They're the people whose identity is caught up in their whole history and life as those who are linked to God's word very closely. Now, what about today? You know, that's kind of asking beyond biblical theology to my Jewish friend, I went to a trivia night with him, and that was great. And there was a question, who named the animals? He didn't know the answer. It's not like in Genesis, in the garden, who named the animals? He didn't know the answer because he's Jewish, but he doesn't know the Bible. He's not a believer in God or anything. I knew the answer, and he was so proud that he'd brought someone who knew his book. He doesn't know his book, but it's his book because he's a person of the law. He's a person of the Torah, and that's his book. So there's something about the identity of him that's caught up with the Torah. That doesn't mean he's saved. It doesn't mean, or anything like that. What it means is there's something about his identity that's special because it's his book, And it's mine too, of course. In Christ, it's mine. But it's kind of really his. So I think it's that kind of thing, but that's what we need to think through a little more. Yeah.
Bill?
I'm just wondering how this reading affects the traditional questions of purpose, audience, structure. Does it interact with that in any way, or those debates interact back into this in some way?
So the question is, how does what you've presented shape how we understand purpose, audience, structure for the book of Romans?
Yeah, I think what it actually does is it helps to bring back and to take back from the Paul within Judaism school, or some members of the Paul within Judaism school, the general traditional idea that basically Romans is written to a mixed group of people, Jewish and Gentile, probably predominantly Gentile, but including Jews in it. There's a very strong reading that has been put forward from the Paul within Judaism school and has been gaining ground, at least in the last little while, that says Paul isn't writing at all to Jews, and he would say something different to Jews. So when they read Romans chapter 2, verse 17, which I think has to be translated, if you are named as a Jew, i.e. if you're Jewish, they would say, well, you translate it as if you call yourself a Jew. So they say, that's not about a Jew, that's about a Gentile who's trying to become a Jew. And what Paul's saying to him is, no, the Jews have got their own way of salvation. You're a Gentile, you've got your way of salvation, so don't try and become a Jew. Now that's, I think it makes no sense, but I've written a whole article on that, and I think I'm convincing people, and there's other people who are seeing that as well. That is, it's the traditional view that the gospel is for everybody. It's for Jew first and also for Greek, and therefore for all the nations, including Israel, including Jews. So it's the more traditional idea, I think. Yeah. There's other debates involved, but that's the big one.
Another question from Slido. What do you make, or could you speak more on Paul saying that the Gentiles' uncircumcision will be counted as circumcision, chapter 2, verse 26, and then that a Jew is one with a circumcised heart, 2:28 to 29?
Yeah. So I'll take the second one first. He's not saying that a Jew is the one with circumcised heart. I think in verse 28 and 29 he's saying there are two kinds of Jewish people. There is the one who's Jewish, but only Jewish in physically, and then there's the Jewish person who's not only a Jew physically, who's got the real circumcision, which is the circumcision of the heart that the prophets were pointing towards. So he's not defining what a Jew is. He's saying there are two kinds of Jewish person, and the one that you really want is the one with a circumcised heart. Just like Gentiles can have a circumcised heart as well, but that's not the point he's making there in verse 29, I think. That's a different point. Going back to verse 26 to 27, that's a reading that I've spelled out in an article. I think Paul's using a particular debate that was going on at the time, and it was a debate about, well, okay, if you've got people coming along to the synagogue and listening to the law, do you have to circumcise them or not? And he's taking the side, it's there in Josephus and other places, he's taking the side of the people who say, no, you don't. You can just count them as circumcised. That's okay. If they're keeping the whole law, the rest of the law, then you can sort of, say that they're circumcised. That's okay. It's an inner Jewish discussion. I don't think he's theologizing. He's not necessarily saying that that God will count them as circumcised in that full sense, although I think God does. That's the point. But that's not the point he's making there. And it's because of the, to be counted, not necessarily by God. There's the word legizomai throughout Romans very often refers to what our own decisions, what we reckon. Sometimes it refers to what God reckons. Part of the problem is that if you say that God reckons this person as circumcised, is that you end up with problems, because in chapter 4, if you're talking about God's reckoning, God reckons somebody as righteous but not because they're circumcised. So apart from circumcision. And so if you say over here God reckons them as circumcised, and over here that God reckons them as righteous apart from circumcision, you end up in some knots, which you can solve, but I think it's far more straightforward to say this is Paul making a point from the situation of the synagogue. But I spell that out in my article. Yep.
Last one, Charles. Yes, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just wondering, how does the issue of Jewish identity and distinctiveness interact with the metaphor of marriage between God and his people? So, like, Paul quotes Isaiah, describes God's people as the beloved in chapter 9. The context of Isaiah is Judah are the kind of bride, Israel being kind of divorced.
Yeah.
How does that metaphor interact with kind of the New Testament? Is there a bride? Are there
Two brides.
two brides? Who is the bride? How does that interact with Judah being the bride?
Okay, so the question is, in terms of distinctiveness of being Jewish, how does that interact with the metaphor of marriage? Are there two brides?
I think that's a good question. God's not a bigamist. I think the answer is reasonably straightforward, and that is that particular part of Romans 9 is not a place that's talking about distinctiveness. That's actually a place that's talking about non-distinctiveness. I'll call my people. So who is the bride? The bride is the church and God's people. And Paul specifically says, I'm going to call my people not only from the Jews but also from the Gentiles. So I think that resolves that one. But so I've emphasised distinctiveness in various places, but in this paper, but there's a whole lot of other places in Romans where there's non-distinctiveness. And that's what I haven't emphasised in this paper, but that's really, 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 really important for Romans, that its unity matters very much. It's just that I've focused on that bit. That helps.
Can we please thank Lionel?